Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Imagine yourself standing in the dim interior of a Sumerian temple, circa 3200 BCE, where the air hangs thick with incense, frankincense and myrrh, blending into a scent so heavy you can almost taste the resin on your tongue. The walls around you are mud brick, cool to the touch despite the desert heat outside, and the only light comes from oil lamps flickering in niches carved at shoulder height, their flames casting shadows that dance like nervous scribes across the sacred space. You're here in Eridu, the very first city according to the Sumerians themselves, a place where the boundary between earth and heaven was supposedly thinnest, where gods walked among mortals and left their instructions in wedge-shaped marks that would outlast empires. The mainstream historical fact you need to know is this: the Sumerians really did develop the world's first writing system around 3200 BCE, initially for accounting and administrative purposes, tracking grain, beer rations and temple goods, before it evolved to record myths, laws, and king lists. But here's where things get deliciously strange, because some fringe interpreters look at those same clay tablets and see not mythology but documentary evidence, insisting the Anunnaki were actual extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold for their dying planet's atmosphere. A theory that makes archaeologists clutch their trowels in despair while YouTube comment sections explode with enthusiasm. Scholars debate endlessly whether the Sumerian texts should be read as literal history, symbolic mythology, political propaganda, or some complex blend of all three. A discussion that's been going on since the 19th century, when Assyriologists first cracked cuneiform, and hasn't reached consensus yet. Probably because consensus is boring, and academics need something to argue about at conferences. Now I should warn you, attempting to understand ancient Mesopotamian theology, while also trying to fall asleep, creates a special kind of cognitive dissonance. You probably won't survive this with your brain fully intact, but at least you'll dream in cuneiform. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're willing to share, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'm endlessly curious whether you're in Tokyo at dawn or Toronto at midnight, building this strange global community of insomniacs and history enthusiasts. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Anunnaki, whose name translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, or possibly princely offspring, depending on which linguist you ask and how generous they're feeling that day, first appear in Sumerian texts as a collective group of deities associated with the earth, the underworld, and cosmic judgment. Not exactly the friendliest job description, is it? The earliest references come from administrative texts and temple hymns, where the Anunnaki are invoked as witnesses to oaths and dispensers of fate, suggesting they occupied a rather bureaucratic position in the divine hierarchy, like cosmic middle managers processing paperwork for the universe. According to the mythology that eventually crystallized in texts like the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis epic, in the beginning there was only primordial water, Apsu the freshwater ocean, and Tiamat the saltwater sea, whose mingling produced the first generation of gods in a creation story that's equal parts cosmogony and extremely awkward family reunion. These original deities, the elder Anunnaki, embodied cosmic principles and natural forces, and the sky god, Ki the earth goddess, Enlil the god of wind and storms, Enki the god of wisdom and freshwater, and dozens more, whose names would fill a celestial phone book nobody asked for. The texts describe how these gods organized themselves into a council, the Anuna or Anunnaki Assembly, which met to decide the fates of gods and mortals alike. Imagine the United Nations, but with better special effects and actual divine authority. Here's a joke for you. Why did the Anunnaki hold so many council meetings? Because even omnipotent beings can't agree on where to go for lunch. Apparently cosmic bureaucracy is eternal and transcends species. In the city of Eridu, where we're metaphorically standing right now, the god Enki established his temple called the Iabzu, or House of the Cosmic Waters, a structure that began as a small shrine around 5000 BCE and was rebuilt and expanded over millennia. Each new layer added like geological strata, preserving the city's relationship with its patron deity. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed 18 successive building levels of this temple, stretching from the Ubaid period through the early dynastic period, concrete evidence that people really did worship here continuously for thousands of years, which should give you perspective on just how young our modern civilization actually is. We've had the internet for barely 30 years, and we think we're advanced. The temple priests would have performed daily rituals at dawn and dusk, offering food, beer, and incense to the statue of Enki, which they believed housed the god's presence, or at least his attention, treating the deity like a very demanding house guest who required constant entertainment and sustenance. Now, the fringe interpretation kicks into high gear here, because ancient astronaut theorists point to Enki's association with wisdom, technology, and genetic knowledge, and claim he was the lead scientist among the extraterrestrial Anunnaki, responsible for later creating or engineering humanity, a reading that makes professional Assyriologists weep into their lexicons, while simultaneously selling millions of books to people who desperately want ancient history to include spaceships. The scholarly debate centers on whether Sumerian religion represented early humanity's attempt to explain natural phenomena through divine action, or whether it preserved garbled memories of actual historical events involving real leaders whose achievements were later mythologized, a discussion complicated by the fact that we're dealing with texts written down centuries after the oral traditions began, copied and recopied by scribes who sometimes added their own interpretations or political spin. Here's another joke. What did the Sumerian scribe say when he made a spelling mistake in wet clay? Well, I guess this is permanent now, which is exactly how I feel about every embarrassing thing I've ever said online. The hierarchy among the Anunnaki was strict and clearly defined in the texts. The 7 supreme Anunnaki who decree the fates occupied the top tier, including An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag the mother goddess, Nana the moon god, Utu the sun god, and Inanna the goddess of love and war, each controlling specific cosmic or earthly domains like middle management, dividing up responsibilities in a celestial corporate structure. Below them ranged hundreds of lesser Anunnaki, each with specific functions. Some controlled irrigation, others governed disease, still others managed dreams, death, and the underworld. A divine specialization that mirrors the increasing complexity of Sumerian society itself, as cities grew and required more elaborate administration. The texts describe how these gods lived in their temples, which were understood not as symbolic dwelling places, but as actual residences where the deity genuinely lived, ate, slept, and held court, with human priests serving as their household staff, a concept that required massive economic resources, because maintaining a god's lifestyle apparently wasn't cheap, what with the daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, and textiles that supported the temple economy. Archaeological evidence confirms that Sumerian temples functioned as economic powerhouses, controlling vast agricultural estates, managing trade networks, employing thousands of workers, and essentially operating as the central banks and administrative centers of early urban civilization, which means religion and economics were so intertwined as to be inseparable, a relationship that hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. Here's your third joke. Why did the Anunnaki need so much gold according to the ancient astronaut theory? Because even advanced aliens apparently haven't figured out that gold is just a shiny rock, and maybe they should have tried therapy instead of intergalactic mining operations. Honestly, the whole thing sounds like a cosmic midlife crisis. The arrival of the Anunnaki in these narratives is treated matter-of-factly, without elaborate explanations. They simply are, existing before the ordering of the cosmos, participating in creation not from nothing but from chaos, organizing the primordial waters and establishing the fundamental structures of reality, including heaven, earth, and the underworld, in a cosmology that's more about arrangement than generation. The famous Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE from earlier sources, begins with the statement, "When kingship was lowered from heaven," suggesting that political authority itself was understood as a divine gift, or alien import. Mainstream scholars read this as theological validation of royal power, while fringe theorists see it as evidence of extraterrestrial intervention in human governance. A debate that somehow manages to be both fascinating and exhausting simultaneously. In the darkness of this temple where you're imagining yourself, you can almost hear the whispered prayers of ancient worshippers, feel the cool clay beneath your sandaled feet, smell the beer offerings going slightly sour in the heat, the sensory reality of a religion practiced not in abstract philosophy, but in daily ritual, in the pouring of libations and the burning of incense, in the belief that gods were present, demanding, and deeply involved in human affairs. The scholarly argument continues about whether the Anunnaki represent deified natural forces, memories of actual prehistoric rulers, products of purely mythological imagination, or some combination thereof, And honestly, after reading enough contradictory academic papers, you start to understand why some people just throw up their hands and decide ancient aliens are as plausible as anything else. Though please don't actually do that, because evidence matters even when it's complicated. Here's your fourth joke of this section. What's the difference between a Sumerian god and a modern celebrity? About 5,000 years and slightly better PR management, although both demand constant tribute and have devoted followers who defend them online. So maybe things haven't changed that much after all. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the weight of 5,000 years of history pressing down like warm sand. The voices of ancient priests chanting in a dead language, the scrape of reed stylus against wet clay, recording debts and divine pronouncements with equal solemnity. And let yourself drift toward that threshold between waking knowledge and sleeping dreams, where the Anunnaki wait, patient as stone, old as writing itself, ready to guide you through the labyrinth of Mesopotamian mythology, and maybe if you're lucky, into actual sleep, where none of this requires citations or fact-checking, and you can just enjoy the cosmic weirdness of it all. The morning sun rises over the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, painting the stepped pyramids in shades of honey and terracotta, as we continue our journey deeper into the chronicles of the Anunnaki and their alleged activities on Earth. Though whether activities means divine governance or extraterrestrial strip mining depends entirely on which bookshelf you're browsing, the archaeology section, or the section labeled speculative nonsense, that's somehow really entertaining. The mainstream historical fact for this section is important. Sumerian civilization developed the world's first known legal code under Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, predating Hammurabi's more famous code by about 3 centuries, establishing written laws that covered everything from murder to property rights to the acceptable price of beer, because even ancient Mesopotamia understood that society requires rules and apparently beer regulation. But here's where interpretation gets interesting, because texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish describe a division of labor among the Anunnaki themselves, with the senior gods assigned to celestial duties, while the junior gods, sometimes called the Ajigi, were forced to perform the exhausting physical labor of earth-shaping, canal digging and city building, a cosmic class system that fringe theorists interpret as evidence of an extraterrestrial mining operation with worker exploitation that would make 19th century industrialists blush with recognition. The scholarly debate here revolves around whether these texts reflect actual social hierarchies being projected onto the divine realm, with gods mirroring the stratified society of kings, priests, and laborers, or whether they preserve some garbled memory of different groups of people, possibly rulers and subjects, later mythologized into distinct categories of divine beings, a discussion that's been ongoing since the 1950s when serious academic attention first turned to Mesopotamian social structures. Now the central figure in these narratives of divine organization is Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm, the god who separates heaven from earth, who holds the tablets of destiny that determine the fates of all beings, and who generally functions as the executive officer of the Anunnaki Council. Imagine a CEO with the power to literally destroy cities with weather patterns, and you're getting close to Enlil's vibe. According to the texts, Enlil's temple at Nippur, called the Ekur or Mountain House, served as the religious center of all Sumer, a neutral sacred site where the gods themselves supposedly convened, and where earthly kings came to legitimize their rule through Enlil's approval. And archaeological evidence confirms that Nippur maintained its religious significance across multiple political dynasties, despite never serving as a major political capital itself, which is actually pretty remarkable when you think about it. A city whose power was purely spiritual, outlasting numerous military empires. Here's your first joke for this section. Why did Enlil always win arguments in the Divine Council? Because when you control storms, every debate eventually comes down to agree with me or enjoy your flood, which is admittedly not the most democratic approach to governance, but definitely effective in the short term. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE, but drawing on much older traditions, describes how the junior Anunnaki gods labored for 40 years digging canals and rivers, exhausted by the endless toil, until they finally rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's house at night, chanting protests, and essentially went on strike against divine management, which is either mythology reflecting labor disputes in early Sumerian society, or if you're feeling adventurous in your interpretation, evidence of worker revolts among alien mining crews. Take your pick based on personal preference and tolerance for academic eye-rolling. The senior Anunnaki, faced with this rebellion, and unwilling to perform the labor themselves because gods apparently have strong feelings about manual work, convened in council to solve the problem, and their solution, proposed by the clever Enki, was to create a new category of beings specifically designed to perform the labor. The junior gods refused, a worker race that would be mortal, limited, and utterly expendable. And yes, that worker race was humanity, which really doesn't reflect well on our origin story. If you think about it too hard at bedtime, the mainstream interpretation reads this as an etiological myth explaining why humans must toil and suffer. We were literally created for labor, our existence justified by our usefulness to the divine order, while fringe theorists see it as a literal account of genetic engineering performed by extraterrestrials who needed workers for their mining operations and created humans by mixing their own DNA with indigenous hominids, a theory that's scientifically questionable but narratively compelling in a weird sci-fi sort of way. Here's your second joke. What did Enki say when asked to create humanity? Sure, how hard could genetic engineering possibly be? What's the worst that could happen? And then 5,000 years later we invented reality television. So that answer is actually pretty clear now, isn't it? The scholarly consensus recognizes these creation narratives as sophisticated theological statements about humanity's place in the cosmos, created by the gods, subordinate to the gods, but also essential to the cosmic order, because someone has to grow the grain for the temple offerings, a worldview that validates both religious authority and social hierarchy, while explaining the fundamental questions of why we exist and why life involves so much unpleasant work. The texts specify that Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag, or Ninmah, her name varies in different traditions, collaborated on human creation, mixing clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god, usually identified as Wheeler or Geshtui, whose intelligence would thereby be transferred to the new beings, a process that's either pure mythological poetry or, according to ancient astronaut enthusiasts, a simplified description of genetic manipulation using clay minerals as culture medium and divine blood representing DNA, which is certainly creative interpretation, if nothing else. The detailed descriptions in texts like the Atrahasis include Ninhursag pinching off 14 pieces of clay, 7 for males and 7 for females, placing them in the room of fate, where goddess midwives would oversee their development for 10 months, which sounds suspiciously like a description of gestation that's been given cosmic significance, scholars note, suggesting the myth incorporates actual observations of human reproduction into its divine framework. Archaeological evidence shows that by the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, Sumerian cities were organizing massive labor projects, irrigation systems, city walls, temple platforms, that required coordinating thousands of workers, managing food supplies, and developing administrative systems to track everything, which gives context to mythology that emphasizes humanity's role as divine workforce. These texts may reflect the social reality of early urban civilization, where labor organization was the foundation of everything else. Here's your third joke for this section. Why were the first humans created according to Sumerian myth? Because the gods were tired of digging their own ditches, which honestly makes humanity sound like the ancient equivalent of a really expensive shovel that complains a lot and occasionally writes poetry, not exactly flattering but probably accurate. The hierarchy established by Enlil's command extended beyond the divine realm into human society, with kings understood as intermediaries between gods and people, priests as divine servants managing the gods' earthly households, and common people as the laboring masses, whose work sustained the entire system, a cosmic chain of command that legitimized social stratification by making it part of creation's fundamental design. The famous Sumerian proverb states, "Man is the shadow of God, but the king is God's reflection," which neatly captures this ideology, where political power derives from divine sanction, not popular consent, making revolution not just illegal, but literally blasphemous, which is admittedly very convenient for whoever's sitting on the throne at any given moment. Fringe interpretations suggest this hierarchy reflects actual genetic differences between humans created as workers and a separate lineage of human-alien hybrids who became the ruling class, the demigods or kings of old, mentioned in various traditions, though mainstream scholarship treats this as pseudo-history that misreads mythology as biology and ignores vast amounts of archaeological and genetic evidence about actual human origins and migrations. The scholarly debate continues about whether Sumerian kingship ideology influenced later traditions, including biblical narratives about humans created to serve and keep the garden and Mesopotamian elements in Genesis flood stories, or whether these represent independent parallel developments. A discussion complicated by the fact that ancient Near Eastern cultures demonstrably influenced each other through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange across thousands of years. Here's your fourth joke. What do Sumerian gods and modern middle managers have in common? Both spend most of their time in meetings complaining about workers who won't take initiative, then get mad when those same workers do take initiative without permission, creating a cosmic catch-22 that spans millennia and apparently transcends the boundary between mortal and divine. The administrative texts from cities like Uruk, Ura, and Lagash reveal the incredible organizational capacity of early Sumerian civilization. Thousands of clay tablets recording grain distributions, work assignments, textile production, livestock management, suggesting that the mythology about divine hierarchies and labor organization emerged from a society that was itself obsessed with organization, management, and proper procedure, where everything from beer rations to festival dates was carefully recorded in cuneiform script on tablets that would outlast the civilization itself. The evidence shows that temples employed full-time weavers, farmers, brewers, bakers, and scribes, complex economic institutions that required sophisticated administration, and the gods were understood as the ultimate employers, with priests managing their estates on earth, which means religion, economics, and politics formed an integrated system where theological beliefs directly shaped material practices, and vice versa. Fringe theorists look at the same administrative tablets and claim they're evidence of extraterrestrial resource management, with grain quotas representing energy supplies for alien bases and temple complexes serving as command centers for off-world operations, an interpretation that requires ignoring basically everything we understand about Bronze Age economics, while simultaneously making ancient accounting significantly more exciting than it actually was, which is sort of impressive in its own way. The figure of Enlil dominates this period of the narrative, described as powerful, decisive, and terrifyingly willing to use destructive force to maintain order. He's the god who later sends the flood to destroy humanity when we become too numerous and noisy, which is either mythology about divine caprice and the danger of angering the gods, or in alternative readings, an extraterrestrial population control measure gone catastrophically wrong, depending on whether you're reading academic journals or late-night conspiracy forums. The Enlil hymns preserved from this period describe him as the great mountain, he whose pronouncements cannot be altered, he who decrees the fates, emphasizing his authority and the absolute nature of his decisions. Poetry that reflects political realities in a world where royal decrees were similarly absolute, and questioning authority could be literally fatal, making theology and politics mirror images of each other. As your consciousness drifts through these accounts of divine command structures and cosmic labor disputes, notice how the air in your room feels cool against your skin, how your breathing has perhaps slowed to match the ancient rhythms we're exploring, how the boundary between historical facts about Sumerian civilization and wild speculation about ancient astronauts creates a strange cognitive space where sleep can creep in unnoticed, carrying you down into dreams that need not concern themselves with proper academic citations, or the difference between mythology and pseudo-archaeology, where Enlil and Enki can be simultaneously gods and aliens and metaphors, and none of it really matters because you're comfortable, warm, and finally starting to drift away from full consciousness into something deeper and more restful, though we still have more sections to cover, so don't get too comfortable just yet. The clay tablets continue their story as we move deeper into the Anunnaki chronicles, and now we reach what might be the most dramatic episode in the entire Mesopotamian mythological cycle, the Ajigi Rebellion, the creation of humanity, and the great flood that nearly destroyed everything the gods had built, a sequence of events that appears in multiple versions across different periods and cities, suggesting these narratives held particular importance for Sumerian and later Babylonian cultures who kept copying and elaborating them across centuries. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this section is crucial. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Mesopotamia indicates a significant flooding event or series of floods during the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, with flood deposits found at Uru, Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak. Though these deposits don't all date to exactly the same time and represent local rather than global catastrophes, suggesting the Great Flood of mythology may preserve memories of actual devastating floods that were then universalized in the storytelling tradition. But here's where things get cosmically weird, because the Atrahasis epic and the earlier Regigenesis both describe this flood as a deliberate act by the Anunnaki Council, specifically by Enlil, who has decided that humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, and generally too annoying to tolerate any longer. The texts literally say we were keeping the gods awake with our racket, which has to be one of the pettiest reasons for genocide in any mythology, and really makes you wonder about the cosmic noise ordinances that apparently existed in ancient divine councils. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. Did these flood myths emerge independently in Mesopotamia and later influence the biblical flood narrative, or were they all responses to actual catastrophic flooding in a region where rivers regularly overflowed and irrigation failures meant famine and death, creating a cultural memory of water as both life-giver and destroyer that gets encoded in religious narrative? Some researchers argue the myths reflect environmental catastrophes at the end of the last ice age when sea levels rose dramatically, while others see them as purely literary inventions meant to explore theological questions about divine justice and human mortality, and still others suggest they preserve folk memories of multiple local disasters conflated into a single cosmic event. So basically nobody fully agrees, and the discussion continues at academic conferences where the coffee is terrible, but the arguments are surprisingly passionate. Now, before the flood comes the creation, and the Atrahasis epic gives us the most detailed account of how the Agigi rebellion led directly to humanity's manufacture. The junior gods, exhausted after 40 years of canal digging and agricultural labor, gather at night with torches and surround Enlil's dwelling, threatening revolt unless their working conditions improve, which is either early labor organizing or the galaxy's first recorded workers' strike, depending on whether you read this as mythology or ancient astronaut documentary. Here's your first joke for this section. What did the Agigi gods chant during their rebellion? What do we want? Less work. When do we want it? After we finish these last 40 canals, because we're already committed, and it would be a shame to leave the project incomplete, which explains why divine labor organizing never really caught on as a movement. Enlil, furious at being surrounded and threatened by his subordinates, initially wants to identify and punish the ringleaders, but his father Anu, the sky god, and Enki, the wisdom god, convince him that the Agigi have a legitimate grievance. The work is genuinely too hard for immortal beings to endure forever. Apparently even gods have labor rights, which is somehow both absurd and weirdly progressive for Bronze Age theology. The solution they devise is to create a replacement worker class, and the texts are quite specific about the process. Enki proposes they slaughter one of the rebelling gods, mix his blood and flesh with clay, and shape the mixture into a new being that will carry the slain god's intelligence, but be mortal, limited, and specifically designed for labor. It's genetic engineering as theological poetry, or theological poetry as garbled memory of genetic engineering. Take your interpretive pick. The god chosen for sacrifice is Wiela, or Geshtue, described as the ringleader of the rebellion, and his slaughter is portrayed as both punishment for revolt and necessary sacrifice for creation, his blood providing the divine essence that makes humans intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, but his death ensuring we inherit mortality as an essential characteristic, which means humanity is literally built from the remains of a rebel god, which explains so much about us really. Here's your second joke. Why was Wiela chosen for the human creation sacrifice? Because apparently being the leader of a labor rebellion qualifies you for involuntary genetic donation, which is definitely not the workplace benefit he was hoping for when he started organizing his fellow gods. Probably should have read the fine print on that divine employment contract. The creation scene involves the mother goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu or Belatili in various texts, who mixes the clay and divine blood, pinches off portions, and assigns birth goddesses to shape 14 humans, 7 male and 7 female, who then develop in a process explicitly compared to gestation, spending 10 months in the room of fate before being born as the first humans, a description that fringe theorists read as ancient description of genetic laboratory work and artificial wombs, while mainstream scholars see sophisticated metaphorical language connecting human creation to human reproduction in a way that makes theological sense within the culture's understanding of life and generation. The scholarly consensus notes that this creation narrative serves multiple functions. It explains human mortality, justifies human labor as our fundamental purpose, validates social hierarchy by making it part of cosmic design, and resolves the theological problem of why gods who are supposedly all-powerful would create beings who suffer. We're not a beloved creation but a utilitarian solution to a divine staffing problem, which is honestly pretty bleak as origin stories go, but at least it's honest about the transactional nature of our existence. Archaeological evidence from early Sumerian sites shows increasing agricultural intensification, expanding irrigation networks, and growing population density from about 4000 BCE onward, creating societies that depended on organized mass labor for survival. The infrastructure of civilization required more hands than any family or clan could provide, necessitating the development of city-states where thousands of people worked in coordinated effort, which gives material context to myths about humanity being created specifically for labor. The theology reflects the lived reality of urban life where work organization was everything. Here's your third joke for this section. What was humanity's first performance review from the Anunnaki? Shows initiative in agriculture, demonstrates adequate tool use, still excessively noisy during designated quiet hours. Recommendation: continue observation before deciding whether to flood them all, which suggests divine HR management was just as petty then as corporate HR management is now. Some things really are eternal. After humanity is created and successfully begins performing the labor the Agigi gods rejected, the texts describe a period of growth and expansion. Humans multiply, cities flourish, agriculture spreads, but this success becomes a problem for Enlil, who grows increasingly disturbed by human population growth and the noise we generate, sending plagues and droughts to reduce our numbers, in what fringe theorists read as population control measures by extraterrestrial overseers and mainstream scholars interpret as mythology, reflecting the reality that epidemics and crop failures regularly devastated ancient populations. The Atrahasis epic describes multiple attempts by Enlil to reduce human numbers. First a plague, then a drought that lasts several years. Each time Enki secretly helps humanity survive by teaching agricultural techniques or medical knowledge, positioning himself as humanity's advocate against Enlil's destructive impulses, which sets up a theological tension between the god who wants to maintain order through control and the god who favors human flourishing, even when it's inconvenient for divine comfort. Finally, frustrated by humanity's resilience and continued population growth, Enlil convinces the divine council to send a great flood that will wipe out all human life, swearing the other gods to secrecy so that humanity cannot prepare or escape. But Enki, who has promised not to tell humans directly, warns his favorite mortal Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, by speaking to the reed wall of his house rather than to the man himself, a technicality that allows Enki to keep his oath while still saving humanity through the classic divine loophole of extremely literal interpretation of rules. Here's your fourth joke. How did Enki justify warning Atrahasis about the flood? I didn't tell him, I told the wall, and if he happened to be standing right there listening, that's hardly my responsibility, which is the kind of clever wordplay that either makes you a wisdom god or gets you fired from middle management. Apparently divine bureaucracy respects technicalities, even during apocalyptic events. Atrahasis is instructed to build a boat. The texts are specific about dimensions and construction techniques, suggesting real boat-building knowledge is embedded in the narrative, to load it with his family, craftsmen, and breeding pairs of animals, and to seal it with bitumen against the coming waters, instructions that will sound extremely familiar if you've ever read the biblical flood narrative in Genesis, because the Mesopotamian flood story predates the Hebrew version by at least 1,000 years and demonstrably influenced it through cultural contact, making the Atrahasis epic essentially the original source for one of the world's most famous myths. The flood itself is described in vivid, terrifying detail. The storm god Adad thunders in the clouds. The Anunnaki raise torches that light up the land. Enlil's destructive power breaks through dikes and barriers, and water covers everything. The texts say even the gods were terrified by the destruction they had unleashed. The Anunnaki cowered like dogs in the highest heaven, and the mother goddess wept at the annihilation of her children, humanity, suggesting divine regret that comes too late to prevent catastrophe. Mainstream scholarship reads this as sophisticated theology, exploring the problem of divine power and its limits. The gods can destroy but cannot escape the consequences of destruction. Violence breeds regret, and absolute power creates absolute responsibility, while fringe interpretations suggest it describes an actual extraterrestrial decision to eliminate a failed genetic experiment that went literally underwater when the aliens either triggered or failed to prevent a natural catastrophe. The boat floats for 7 days and nights while the flood rages, then grounds on a mountain. Mount Nimush in the Atrahasis version, different mountains in other versions of the same story. Atrahasis releases birds to test whether the waters have receded, and when a raven doesn't return, He knows dry land exists somewhere, so he opens the boat, releases the animals, and makes a sacrifice to the gods. And the gods, who have been starving without human offerings during the flood, smell the sacrifice and gather like flies around it. A detail that's simultaneously comic and profound, showing gods as dependent on humans, even as humans are subordinate to gods. The scholarly debate continues about whether this flood narrative preserves actual memory of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia's flood-prone river valleys, perhaps the filling of the Persian Gulf at the end of the last ice age, or whether it's purely mythological, a story designed to explain human-divine relationships and the precariousness of existence rather than document historical events. Though most scholars now accept that real flood experiences likely influenced the narrative's formation, even if the cosmic scale is poetic exaggeration. Enlil, furious that humans have survived his extermination attempt, confronts Enki, who admits his role in saving Atrahasis, and here the texts diverge in their endings. Some versions have Enlil reluctantly accepting humanity's survival and establishing new rules, limiting population growth, menopause, infant mortality, celibate priestesses, while others have him acknowledging that human labor is actually necessary for cosmic order. So complete extermination was never really viable anyway, both endings suggesting a negotiated settlement where humans continue to exist, but under new constraints, which is either theology about divine mercy having limits, or extraterrestrial policy adjustment after a failed culling operation. Interpret according to your personal tolerance for ancient astronaut theories. As your mind drifts through these tales of rebellion, creation, and near extinction, feel how your body has settled deeper into your mattress, how your breathing has synchronized with the ancient rhythm of the story, how the boundary between the mythological past and your present moment has blurred into a comfortable twilight state, where Enlil and Enki and Atrahasis are both utterly remote, separated by 5,000 years, and somehow present in the narrative space we're creating together here in the dark, where floods are both geological events and theological statements and pseudo-historical claims about aliens, where clay mixed with blood becomes humanity, and humanity becomes you, lying here, listening, drifting, finally allowing yourself to slip towards sleep, while the Anunnaki complete their cosmic drama in the theater of your relaxing consciousness. The waters recede, and the world begins again, but everything has changed. The flood has reset the cosmic relationship between gods and humans, establishing new boundaries and new rules for how the Anunnaki will interact with their creation, and the texts that describe this post-Diluvian period mark a transition from the age of direct divine intervention to the age of divine human intermediaries, the sacred kings who will rule as representatives of heaven, until the Anunnaki gradually withdraw from active participation in earthly affairs, their presence fading from direct appearance to distant influence to mere memory recorded in tablets that will puzzle archaeologists millennia later. The mainstream historical fact for this section is essential: the Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier sources, divides history into pre-flood and post-flood periods, claiming that after the flood swept over and kingship was lowered from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish, marking a fundamental break in the cosmic order and the beginning of recorded historical dynasties that we can sometimes correlate with archaeological evidence, transitioning from purely mythological time to semi-historical time, where legends about kings may preserve garbled memories of actual rulers, even if the details are hopelessly exaggerated. But here's where interpretation gets deliciously complicated. The king list attributes impossibly long reigns to early kings. Ululim of Eridu supposedly ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years, 8 kings total reigning for a combined 241, 200 years before the flood. Numbers that mainstream scholars interpret as either mathematical scribal errors, symbolic numerology, or the combination of multiple king lists from different cities into one mythological sequence, while fringe theorists read them as literal lifespans of Anunnaki or Anunnaki-human hybrids whose advanced genetics or technology allowed for extreme longevity, connecting them to biblical patriarchs who also have suspiciously long lifespans. Methuselah's 969 years seems almost modest compared to Sumerian kings, and suggesting both traditions preserve memories of an earlier era when beings lived much longer than modern humans. The scholarly debate centers on whether these king lists served primarily political functions, legitimizing later dynasties by connecting them to cosmic authority, or whether they attempted to preserve actual historical information in a culture without modern chronological methods. Forced to work with oral traditions, genealogies, and temple records that may have been partial, contradictory, or deliberately altered by later scribes with political agendas. After the flood, according to the Etrahasis epic's conclusion, Enlil accepts humanity's survival, but demands new limitations. The mother goddess creates new categories of women who will not reproduce: priestesses, certain types of demons, women who die in childbirth, effectively instituting population controls through social and biological mechanisms, while Enki teaches humanity additional technologies, improved agriculture, metallurgy, weaving, brewing, that will make civilization possible, but also create the complex urban societies that require kings to manage, thus solving the divine noise problem, not through genocide but through organization and dispersion of population across multiple cities. Here's your first joke for this section. What was Enlil's post-flood population control policy? If we can't eliminate humans entirely, at least we can invent bureaucracy to make them organize themselves quietly, which suggests the real punishment for humanity wasn't mortality but middle management, a curse that echoes through the ages and currently manifests in quarterly reports and performance reviews. The texts describe how kingship itself is reconstituted after the flood, no longer as direct divine rule, but as delegated authority. The gods choose human kings, who will serve as their earthly representatives, ruling cities and maintaining temples, offering sacrifices and organizing labor, essentially managing divine estates on behalf of absent landlords who remain in heaven, except for occasional visits during major festivals. The Sumerian term for this is Namlugal, literally big manship, which was lowered from heaven according to the king list, suggesting kingship wasn't a human invention, but a divine gift or installation, an ideology that conveniently legitimizes royal authority as cosmic, rather than merely human, making rebellion against the king tantamount to blasphemy against the gods, who appointed him very convenient for maintaining social order, and very inconvenient for anyone hoping to democratize Bronze Age politics. Archaeological evidence from the early dynastic period shows the emergence of palace complexes, distinct from temple complexes around 2900 BCE, suggesting the development of secular political authority that was nevertheless religiously sanctioned, creating the dual power structure of temple and palace that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Priests managed divine estates and religious ritual, while kings managed military defense and civic administration, theoretically cooperating, but often competing for resources and authority, in ways the texts occasionally preserve, through complaints about royal interference in temple business, or priestly criticism of royal policy. Here's your second joke. Why did the Anunnaki decide to rule through human intermediaries instead of directly? Because even immortal beings eventually realize that dealing with urban zoning disputes and irrigation maintenance schedules is tedious beyond measure. Better to delegate that stuff to mortals who don't have anything better to do with their brief lives anyway, which is either cynical theology or accurate assessment of what kingship actually involved on a daily basis. The post-flood kings in the Sumerian tradition are presented as semi-divine figures, often described as offspring of divine human unions. Gilgamesh, the most famous, is said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human, his mother the goddess Ninsun, and his father a mortal priest-king, giving him superhuman strength and wisdom while keeping him mortal and eventually subject to death, a status that defines his epic quest for immortality and his ultimate failure to achieve it, making him a bridge figure between the fully divine Anunnaki and purely human mortals. Fringe interpretations read these semi-divine kings as literal genetic hybrids, the result of Anunnaki breeding with humans to create a ruling class with superior capabilities, the Nephilim of biblical tradition, the heroes of old, men of renown, who occupied an intermediate space between heaven and earth, while mainstream scholarship sees them as mythological expressions of the concept that kings must be extraordinary beings to justify their power, superhuman but not fully divine, exceptional but ultimately mortal, like all humans. The texts describe how these kings maintained direct contact with the gods through rituals, dreams, and oracles, visiting temples to receive divine instruction, performing sacred marriages with goddesses, or rather with priestesses representing goddesses, to ensure fertility of land and people, and consulting with priests who interpreted omens and divine will. The infrastructure of a religious politics where every decision required theological justification, and where royal authority depended on maintaining proper relationships with divine powers. The scholarly consensus recognizes this as sophisticated political theology that sacralized kingship while also limiting it. The king is great, but the gods are greater. Royal power is real but derivative, and failure to maintain proper ritual or ethical standards could result in divine abandonment and political collapse. An ideology that explains political change without completely destabilizing the concept of divine order. Here's your third joke for this section. What's the hardest part of being a semi-divine king in ancient Sumer? Definitely the divine performance reviews where your mum is a goddess and your dad is dead, so family meetings are really awkward and nobody can agree on whether your failures are nature or nurture. Plus the pressure to achieve immortality when you're genetically predetermined to fail really sets you up for disappointment from the start. As the post-flood period progresses in the mythological chronology, the Anunnaki appear less frequently in human affairs, no more direct conversations, fewer miraculous interventions, a gradual withdrawal from active presence in the world, and scholars debate whether this narrative pattern reflects historical changes in religious practice, perhaps a shift from more immediate ecstatic religion to more formalized temple ritual, or whether it's simply a literary device, allowing the texts to transition from mythological time, where anything is possible, to historical time, where events must seem more plausible and align with lived experience. The later Babylonian texts, especially the Enuma Elish composed around 1200 BCE, reorganized the pantheon with Marduk as the supreme deity, subordinating the old Sumerian Anunnaki to supporting roles, a change that reflects Babylon's political rise and its need to validate its patron god's supremacy, showing how mythology adjusts to political reality as empires rise and fall, and each new power center requires theological justification for its dominance. Fringe theorists interpret this mythological evolution as evidence of actual extraterrestrial departure, claiming the Anunnaki left Earth after establishing human civilization and hybrid ruling classes, returning occasionally to check on their experiment, but gradually reducing contact until they finally withdrew completely, leaving only monuments, pyramids, ziggurats, and texts, myths, king lists, as evidence of their presence, a narrative that neatly explains why we don't see ancient aliens now, while maintaining they definitely existed then, which is convenient if completely unsupported by actual evidence beyond creative reinterpretation of ancient texts. The mainstream archaeological narrative describes a much more gradual process. The Sumerian city-states of the early dynastic period gave way to the Akkadian Empire under Sargon around 2334 BCE, which eventually collapsed and was replaced by a Sumerian Renaissance, which fell to the Amorites who established Babylon, which rose and fell multiple times, with each transition bringing new languages, new peoples, new gods layered over or merged with old gods, creating the complex palimpsest of Mesopotamian religion, where Anunnaki titles and attributes get redistributed among Babylonian and Assyrian deities in a process of continuous theological evolution driven by political change. Here's your fourth joke. Why did the Anunnaki gradually stop appearing in Mesopotamian texts? Either they returned to their home planet, disappointed in their creation, or they became middle management in heaven and got too busy with celestial paperwork to visit Earth anymore, or, and stay with me here, they were mythological beings whose narrative function changed as Mesopotamian society evolved, and storytellers adapted old myths to new cultural contexts. But that last explanation is way less exciting, so let's just say they got promoted to corporate and became too important for field visits. The final kings attributed to the heroic age, figures like Gilgamesh of Uruk, Lugalbanda, Dumuzid the shepherd, occupy an ambiguous space between mythology and history. They appear in the king list, giving them quasi-historical status, but the stories about them are clearly legendary, full of impossible feats, divine encounters and monsters, suggesting these were real rulers whose actual accomplishments were dramatically embellished in oral tradition until the historical person became indistinguishable from their mythological reputation. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself, our most complete Mesopotamian literary work, chronicles this king's futile quest for immortality. After his friend Enkidu dies, he seeks out Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who survived the flood and was granted immortality by the gods, hoping to learn the secret, but ultimately learns that immortality is reserved for gods alone, that death is humanity's inevitable fate, and that the only immortality available is through lasting works and remembrance, a profound meditation on mortality that resonates across millennia, and suggests the Mesopotamians were grappling with the same existential questions we face now. As the narrative of divine presence fades in these later texts, replaced by tales of human struggle, achievement, and ultimate failure, you might notice how your own consciousness is fading similarly, how the Anunnaki have receded into the comfortable distance of history, or myth, or pseudo-history, how none of it requires your active attention anymore, how the gentle rhythm of this narration has perhaps lulled you into a state between waking and sleeping, where Gilgamesh's quest and your own journey toward rest are somehow parallel processes, both seeking something just beyond reach, both accepting what cannot be changed, both finding peace in the acceptance of limitation. And as these ancient tablets close their accounts of gods and kings and floods and cities now dust, you can let your mind settle into the darkness that precedes sleep, knowing there's just one more section before this particular story ends, and you can fully surrender to whatever dreams may come. So here we are, at the end of our journey through 5,000 years of Sumerian mythology, fringe speculation, and actual archaeological fact, having traced the Anunnaki from their first appearance in clay tablets through divine councils, human creation, catastrophic floods, and gradual withdrawal into the background of history. And what have we learned except that ancient Mesopotamians had incredibly complex theology, modern people have incredibly creative interpretations, and sleep is still somehow eluding you if you're still listening to these words instead of drifting in dreams. Though honestly, that's fine, because the journey itself has value, even if the destination of actual sleep remains frustratingly distant for some of you insomniacs who know you should be unconscious by now, but somehow can't quite let go. The Sumerian records reveal a civilization that understood itself as created for divine service, living in cities that were literally owned by gods, ruled by kings who derived authority from heaven, maintaining cosmic order through ritual and labor, a worldview so foreign to modern secular democracy that it requires real imaginative effort to comprehend how people actually lived and thought within that framework, where religious and civic duties were inseparable, where the temple was the economic center, and where the boundary between natural and supernatural was nothing like our modern distinction. The fringe interpretations, whatever their evidentiary shortcomings, remind us that these ancient texts continue to fascinate, precisely because they describe events and beings that exceed normal human experience, creating narrative gaps that speculation rushes to fill, whether with theology, mythology, or ancient astronaut theories. Humans seem driven to find meaning in these old stories, to connect them to our own questions about origins, purpose, and whether we're alone in the cosmos. The scholarly debates demonstrate that even professional academics who spend careers studying cuneiform tablets don't fully agree on what these texts meant to their original audiences or what they should mean to us now. Were they history, theology, propaganda, entertainment, or some blend of all four? Did the people who wrote them believe literally in divine councils and flood-surviving boats, or did they understand these as sophisticated metaphors for deeper truths about power, mortality, and human-divine relationships? We honestly don't know for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty is valuable, keeping us humble about our interpretative abilities and open to multiple readings of extremely old texts. What we can say with confidence is that Sumerian civilization was real, their cities existed and can be excavated. Their writing system genuinely was the first we know of. Their legal codes influenced all subsequent Near Eastern law. Their mathematics and astronomy were remarkably sophisticated. Their literature influenced biblical traditions, and through them all of Western culture, and their religious ideas about creation, floods, and divine kingship echoed through millennia. So whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, or mythological constructs hardly matters to their historical importance. They shaped human civilization in ways we still experience. As you lie there in the darkness, perhaps finally feeling genuine drowsiness settling over you like a warm blanket, consider how strange it is that we're connected across such vast distances of time and space. Ancient Sumerian priests inscribing wet clay with reed stylus, medieval scribes copying crumbling tablets into Arabic, Victorian scholars deciphering cuneiform, modern academics debating translations, fringe theorists spinning alien narratives, and you listening in whatever corner of the world you currently occupy. All of us linked by these stories about beings who supposedly descended from heaven to earth, whether 5,000 years ago or 450,000 years ago, depending on which timeline you accept. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, have completed their journey through our narrative, from cosmic creators to mining supervisors to gradually absent gods to textual references that scholars decode, and enthusiasts reinterpret, and skeptics dismiss. They've given us tonight's journey, a thread connecting ancient Mesopotamia to your present moment, a story complex enough to occupy the conscious mind, while the unconscious mind quietly prepares for sleep. So let's bring this to a close. If you've found any value in this strange exploration of Sumerian mythology and ancient astronaut theories and actual archaeology, all blended into one rambling bedtime narrative, please do subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the validation though, honestly, who doesn't? But because it helps other people find these videos when they're lying awake at 3 a.m., desperate for something to listen to that's interesting enough to hold attention, but gentle enough to permit sleep. That strange niche these videos apparently fill. Thank you for sharing this time with me, for bringing your insomnia, or your curiosity, or your genuine interest in ancient Mesopotamian culture to this peculiar corner of the internet where we explore history as sleep aid. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you're comfortable. I hope your breathing has deepened. I hope your thoughts are beginning to drift and scatter like clay tablets eroding in the desert wind. And I hope very soon now you'll feel that final letting go, that surrender to sleep that we've been working toward across these 12,000 words of Sumerian gods and alien theories and archaeological facts, all blended together into something that hopefully helped rather than hindered your quest for rest. The ziggurats crumble, the tablets break, the cuneiform fades, empires fall, and 5,000 years pass like a single night's dream. But here at the end of it all, you're still here, breathing, resting, preparing to sleep. And that simple continuity of human existence, people lying down to rest, night after night, across all those centuries, somehow makes the Anunnaki's journey and your journey connect in the timeless space where all stories eventually end. Sweet dreams of ancient cities and star-wandering gods, of clay tablets and cosmic councils, of floods survived and civilizations built, and when you wake tomorrow, the Anunnaki will still be there in their tablets, waiting patiently for the next person to read their story and wonder what it all meant. But for now, for you, this particular telling is complete, and sleep beckons with soft insistence, pulling you down into rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.